Okay, hi, this is John Reed. I've got a couple of, gosh, what can I call you guys? Developer advocates, open source enthusiasts, grouches with a chip on your shoulder, all of the above. Ethan and
Recalcitrant.
Graham, what's
Hey,
going
John.
on?
Hey, Graham.
Hey guys.
Graham, I have to remember that your last name is actually not Robo, but for our viewers, I have it right, so that's all that matters.
My
That's
first name
good.
is
Yeah,
not
that's the
S.
right twin.
Yeah. So Graham's already into tomorrow in Australia. Thanks for getting up for this. A little more than a year ago, we did a developer engagement report card with SAP. Now they've done a bunch of stuff, but these guys still aren't satisfied. I want to find out why. And we're also going to talk about the business case for developers and why it matters. So pour yourself a nice hot drink, put the video on pause because this one's going to take a little while to unpack. But we're going to start, though, on the controversial topic du jour, which is the debate about whether Fiori should be free is heating up all of a sudden, and there's a few different reasons for that. But the bottom line is that Fiori, because it's a sort of next-generation UI for SAP, that debate ties in a lot to what we were going to talk about anyway. So, Ethan, would you care to share your views on that?
Well, I mean, I think the general discussion is around whether these sort of UI enhancements or upgrades should be free. And the context is that a lot of SAP's competitors, especially in the cloud space now, provide UI updates as part of the ongoing maintenance of their application. My opinion, yeah, I guess free would be better, definitely. I think some people have made the point that there's always a cost associated with these things, whether or not the software is free. My real concern is that whether or not the software is going to get deployed to as many customers as possible. And I think for SAP to do that, they basically just have to roll it into a standard upgrade, whether that's an enhancement pack or even a support package. And for that, it has to be free. Otherwise, it's just going to take a long, long time to trickle out to the customer base. Personally, I think that SAP's argument that these are actually new apps and not UI enhancements is a little bit thin, and I'd really like to see them try to get them out to as many customers as possible.
Graham?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit amused how this topic's come up again because, geez, it's 18 months ago, I think, that it was first muted. Well, certainly it was 6 months before the first Fiori Wave 1 were released at Sapphire in the States that I remember sitting down with some SAP people, and not just on my own, but there was a few of us, and saying, quite strongly that we just couldn't see a justification for charging for this sort of stuff. And then, that was at the stage where we'd just been through the same process with the Gateway product, and I didn't push it much beyond that. I mean, my opinion certainly is that my opinion is not that I think some of the wording's wrong. I don't think these products should be free. I think your maintenance and your existing user license should include them. And that's a slight difference in terms, but I think it's an important difference. I think SAP customers are paying a lot in maintenance, and they're seeing SAP spend their money on acquiring other organisations and building new products on new platforms, and then asking them to buy new licenses for them. It's not a good look. It's not a way to be popular, and then to be nickel and diming them on something like this is just a terrible PR move, especially where the stated aim of this product was all about getting adoption and changing the perception of usability and UIs for SAP. Adoption's the key to that, and just any friction there, I think, is just a bad idea.
Yeah, I give some credit to SAP's Yuri Zur, who's been very active on UI for SAP, although not on Fiori as a day-to-day role. But he wades into these discussions, blazing with his opinions from SAP's side, and someone's got to represent some of those views. One of them is that you hear a lot from SAP is that without account executives driving a product and having a sales incentive around a product, that product's not going to get adopted by the customer base. What do you guys think of that, and your thoughts?
I find it depressing. If SAP doesn't have a channel outside of its account executives, and account executives aren't willing to push innovations that are good for customers unless they have a price tag attached to them, then I think that's a real problem for SAP going forward, because it won't be able to push out necessary innovations to customers, whether or not they provide customer value, unless it can convince people to pay for them. So SAP could quickly find itself, and maybe already has found itself, in a situation where its install base is extremely segmented, and a lot of old systems exist, and it has a hard time supporting all of those different types of installations and supporting an upgrade path for all those different types of installations. So I think it's in SAP's interest to get people onto modern platforms.
Yeah, and you know, I fully understand and have heard before, especially from Yariv. I've spent a lot of time talking to him about this topic and some other people, and I understand where they're coming from. I question whether Fiori is a product. You know, it isn't. Surely it's just another piece of technology. What SAP, the products SAP sell, ERP, CRM, SRM, BW. They're the products that the business execution engines is what they sell. The little bits of technology that sit around it, you know, that's not what they sell. That's not what they should be selling, and that's not how they've been successful.
I think one thing that's interesting about the Fiori discussion is that, in addition to the points you guys made, is that there's a real strong business case for essentially making it easy to consume and adopt Fiori, and some of that has to do with laying the groundwork for HANA sales that are potentially much more substantial for SAP. I don't want to spoil my own blog post, but I'm planning to do a post that hits on some of these issues, and I'm gonna say the new lock-in is community lock-in, which is you lock in customers by building a dynamic community around your products, and some of that means giving them the best user experience and giving them a lot of quote-unquote free ways of, or what you call frictionless ways of, you know, getting more change into their environments. And obviously Fiori is not free, but the point is that when you modernize to Fiori, not only do you get that UI experience, but there's a lot of future benefits you can get. So to me, there's a really strong business case around this, so it's not simply just the old, well, SAP's customers deserve better, and that, you know what I mean? That's part of it for some, but I think you could break this down in simple business terms.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is, why did SAP create Fiori in the first place? If everything was okay and fine and dandy in the SAP UI world, then what's the point? So, and obviously it wasn't. I mean, there was a need among SAP customers for a new UI paradigm, for a modern UI paradigm, and to kind of not make the value crystal clear, or rather the cost versus value equation crystal clear, is going to result in a lot of people holding back, and it's not going to look too good compared to SAP's newer competitors.
I thought it was interesting also that a Sugan representative chimed in on the Diginomica post that John Appleby
that was very interesting.
So essentially it seems from the comment that Sugan essentially has requested SAP that Fiori be essentially free, quote unquote, as we discussed, right, and that they're currently awaiting a response. So that could be very interesting also. So as Fiori turns, sets up a nice drama heading into Sapphire, though, guys. You gotta admit that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
I hope there's more to talk about at Sapphire than just Fiori, though.
You do? Well, we could talk about why SAP changed the name Teca to Deco. That should give us. We could talk about that for at least an hour. But anyway, we're not going to do that. So let's take a step back a little bit, and I just want to ask you guys, as you are dedicated developers, passionate about open source and building apps, but why does developer engagement matter to SAP? I mean, obviously their big partners have access to all the tools they need, So we're talking about expanding that to so many constituents who have a lot of expertise in programming but haven't historically been included, though that is starting to change. But why should companies like SAP even care about a video session like this one?
Why don't you take this one, Graham? I've been going first now.
Okay. Well, I guess in some ways I'm picking up on a phrase you just used, John. You know, the engagement of a community around this ecosystem that SAP has includes developers, and I guess you know, the SAP are clearly moving to a more of a platform play. And for platforms to be successful, you need people to use them to build applications. So the success of a platform play relies heavily on developers to use the platform to build applications. And the other thing that has obviously changed the developer world really is the apps. You know, the 14, 15-year-old kids can get an Apple Mac, download Xcode, build a iOS application, publish it on a Apple Store, and make money. And so the whole democratization, if you like, consumerization of the development thing has meant that people are looking for new ways to do things and new ideas. And unfortunately, the people that are doing that aren't living in the enterprise world. You know, the people that are leading edge in development and new development paradigms and tools and techniques are the people that are outside of the traditional SAP developer. You know, they're not the ABAPer sitting in the back room coding SQL statements and write statements and writing Dinpro screens. They're people with a much broader view, a much more open view about the possibilities and capabilities of maybe blending information from multiple sources to produce a new unique application, a new unique business case. And SAP and no one basically in their industry can afford to cut themselves off from that pipeline of innovation and ideas and that amazing feedback loop and that community building that you touched on that almost makes forces unstoppable, like the Apple App Store has almost become an unstoppable force. Lots of people have tried to duplicate it, and with very few successes.
Yeah, I would just expand on that and point out that the community is extremely important, and what I would often talk about is the developer ecosystem is extremely important to SAP. SAP is enormously dependent on both non-SAP developers who develop add-ons and also non-SAP systems integrators to install and manage their software. Sometimes painfully dependent on those people. And I guess the question would be whether SAP wants kind of the best people or whether they want the people who happen to have access to the SAP ecosystem. And the way it works now is they get the people who happen to have access to the SAP ecosystem, whether that means that they were hired by the right systems integrator and trained, or happen to know the right person, or somehow got an in. It's just not a very accessible ecosystem. And that doesn't mean they don't have great people and some of the best people in the industry, but I think that there could be a lot more really good people working on SAP software and implementations if SAP was more open to non-SAP developer communities. So that's my primary concern and motivation for trying to get more of this stuff out there, is to be able to work with all these people out in open source and non-SAP development communities that I want to work with. And so right now the way I do that is go out to those communities, but it would be nice if they could come to ours too.
I think that's a good summary. The only thing I would add is that I think that in the future, you fast forward a few years, I really think that customers are really going to buy applications based on their entire applications ecosystems, and that means lots of apps from lots of developers. That means the ease at which they can build their own apps, and a lot of this is going to be cloud-based, and a lot of it's going to be mobile delivery, and those skills are not easily obtained internally sometimes, and so you need external support to make that all happen. So to me, that's why this matters. And so we're going to dig into this issue from the vantage point of what it takes for developers to actually go to market. So essentially have your apps on a thriving marketplace of some kind, which is a fairly high standard, I think, to judge SAP by, but I think it's the right one, right? The days of simply saying, oh, I had a great time playing around with UI5 at an InnoJam are kind of over as far as that being the desirable end state. So let's take it a little further, guys, and look at what it would take to actually get to the apps marketplace vision. Fair enough? I see some nods, so we're good. So why don't we just quickly just set the stage with what happened towards the end of the year, because I just want to make sure that viewers understand kind of where we left things off, because Bangalore, the last tech ed of the season, and hey, I guess the last tech ed ever if you want to get technical on naming, there were a series of significant announcements, and then there's been a shift in leadership around this topic inside of SAP. So does anyone want to sort of summarize at first kind of where we left things with this universal developer license and that kind of stuff?
Sure. I mean, yeah, go ahead, Grant.
Well, I was going to say that, I mean, the big announcement just prior to that tech ed was really that SAP had attempted to clear away a lot of the legal issues around IP ownership of stuff developed on SAP platforms and things like that, which has always been a bugbear to try and take that away. It's still, it's still probably, I still haven't been able to find a single A4 sheet of paper and a couple of sentences that explain it all, but still got to sort of ask questions and get maybe answers. But I think they've done a pretty good job to sort of say basically if a developer develops something, they own the IP for it, which is a long, long way from where they were before. I'm not sure how much people are aware of it, but essentially a customer license agreement says that any app developed on your system, SAP have first right of refusal for it, and you can't sell it and do anything like that for. So to actually develop app applications, you had to sign up as a partner and buy a developer license for app, which is not a cheap price, and do all that sort of jump through those hoops. So those sort of things have gone away. So that was the big one for me. In conjunction with that was significantly more software is now available for download for non-productive use. And at no cost, so your developers can download and get access to most of the SAP software suite, assuming they've got hardware to put it on or they want to run it up in the cloud. Some of them are virtual machines in clouds, a lot of them are things like that, so you just throw a few dollars at Amazon and can spin up an instance of the mobile platform or HANA and things like that. So all that's pretty good and exciting stuff. We'll always have the debate about whether Amazon's cheap or Amazon's expensive. It sort of depends on which part of the world you come from, but certainly it's accessible anyway. Yeah,
and I think the other big announcement, right, was the Open UI5, of course, where SAP took what is known as SAP UI5, kind of slashed off a large piece of it and put it out on pretty much a zip file, but under the Apache license. So what that did was make it so that people can use that library in non-SAP applications if they want to. I guess it's open sourcing it in the most technical of technical senses, in that they put an open source license on it. I think we'll get into what needs to happen next, but just doing that is a major step for SAP. So it potentially bodes well. We'll see.
And this attempt to unify developer licenses instead of trying to always do it product by product seemed to be a significant aspect as well. We should also note the leadership changes that occurred around developer engagement inside of SAP. Ann Hardy's team had been leading the charge with external engagement. That included Jürgen Schmurter. And they actually did some real yeoman's work with SAP Legal, sorting through a lot of stuff. But they've now shifted to internal developer engagement, and we now have a team headed up by Ingrid Vandehugen, if I got her name pronounced vaguely right. If I didn't, Ingrid, sorry, I butchered it. And I also want to note Thomas Grassel also is working on Ingrid's team on this, and Thomas is not someone a lot of people may know, but he's definitely someone who's dedicated and passionate about this topic. So they get to take the baton and have the pleasure and exquisite joy of hearing feedback sessions such as this. So welcome aboard. I also want to point out that a little more than a year ago when we issued our report card, we had 3 sort of top wish list items. One was free downloadable software, pretty much of all kinds, and that had to do with the fact that the cloud-based option doesn't always work for a variety of reasons. Consistent IP ownership across the board, which included core NetWeaver components, and also solve gateway and related licensing issues for developers with simple license agreements, and gateway being kind of a cornerstone for opening up SAP to external developers and folks who aren't geeked up on ABAP like these guys are. So that's kind of where we left things. It was actually 15 months ago that we laid that down, guys, if you can believe that. Sounds
like someone was listening.
Yeah. So a lot of water under the bridge, and what I'd like to do is focus first on SAP developers in particular. Then we can look at not how you think this plays out for outside developers who aren't too familiar with SAP, but starting with sort of SAP developer community, what kind of progress has been made, and also why are you unhappy to a certain extent? Because I was a little surprised when these announcements came out, because you two are kind of my sort of bellwether for this, and I was expecting you to be kind of like psyched, and I don't want to say you weren't like, let's see, I guess you were kind of like, you seemed kind of disappointed in a way. Like I was like, where's the enthusiasm, guys? And
I feel like SAP listened and kind of to some extent did what we asked, but didn't necessarily kind of understand the point. And so I was happy to see what happened, but there may be some more cultural change that needs to take place. I sort of feel like, to make an analogy, I sort of feel like when we say open up to the non-SAP developer community, or say things like open source, SAP sometimes hears a very specific and technical term, kind of like when SAP talks about HANA as an in-memory database platform. And when SAP talks about that, what they really mean is HANA, yeah, okay, so it has the data in memory, but it also has a columnar store, and it's massively parallel processing, and all kinds of cool stuff underneath the covers there. And then a competitor of SAP comes along and they say, oh, we put our database in memory, it's all in RAM now, so it's the same, right? And SAP says, no, it's not the same. We do all this other stuff, and it's kind of a similar situation. So I mean, yeah, there were great improvements, and I think I was pretty clear about that in my comments on it. But way more access to SAP software, most of it cloud-based. We can get into why I think it needs to be downloadable as well. And the IP ownership thing that Anne's team and Jürgen and Rui laid the groundwork for with SAP Legal, and having one license for pretty much all of the developer-oriented software, and not a bad license. It's pretty clear, and pretty clear about IP ownership. That's really a great advancement, and hopefully will make life a lot easier for groups that work on this area with SAP in the future, internal groups that are trying to release software outside of SAP. Hey, Graham, you're going to have to cover the gateway licensing thing, because I actually don't know anything about it, but how'd they do there?
Well, I mean, I think the gateway licensing thing, we've got to a good spot. I mean, I guess part of the reason I've been less than enthusiastic about some of these things is they have taken a long time. We've been talking about things and saying these are the sort of things we want, and we've started with baby steps, and they have taken a really, really long time. And I've got to say, one of the things that really sort of upset me was the whole code exchange thing. I mean, as developers, we need a place to be able to, a repository to put our code, to share it, so we can collaborate and work on stuff. We need Git, right? And we didn't have that, and a lot of people inside and outside of SAP worked really, really hard over a long period of time, and the fights over legal and stuff like that to get code exchange in place, which was a long way from perfect. There was a lot of things that code exchange never got to do, but it was there was a lot of hard work went into doing that, and the way that thing was just cut off showed that, to me, that the people responsible for doing that didn't appreciate the importance and the relevance of that component of a community of developers working together, and so I felt, not so much for myself, but for the people that I know that put an awful lot of work into that, pretty disillusioned by that, and thought that so I guess that's a good example of my disillusionment, and a lot of it's around timing. It takes, the Open UI5 thing is a great initiative. I fear it's at least 12 months too late. I think the crest of the wave when the developer community were really looking for something like what UI5 provides was 12 months ago. If they could have been given access to it then and contributed to it then and forked it and made their own enhancements and improvements, and that community building had happened as the technology was emerging, I think you'd have now quite a good core of supporters, which is what they're trying to find now, and that's always the frustrating thing. These things take a bit too long.
Yeah, it's essentially too late, and it's going to be later because what they've put out on GitHub now is not an open source community or an open source project in any sense of the word. It's a zip file, and there's no way to report issues or contribute back code or significantly change or anything like that. So there's a lot of work still to do to make Open UI5 really open. I mean, in my opinion, the way SAP needs to run these types of development projects is, like, perhaps they do a core sort of early innovation project internally in SAP, but then the whole process needs to completely turn inside out. And the development needs to happen in the open, in an open community, run in an open way. Sure, it can be owned by SAP, but it has to be transparent. And then when SAP wants to cut a release, then they make a zip file, and they package that with their NetWeaver release. And so it goes the other direction. And that's what SAP needs to do to have credibility as a steward of open source projects. But, what can you say? It is progress. It is slow. And so that definitely saps some enthusiasm. but things are getting better. And if the momentum builds, that's great. If the momentum kind of stays how it is, then SAP is in trouble, because definitely SAP is behind as far as open developer engagement type stuff, and so it needs to be moving faster than its competition.
Do you think this is a classic juxtaposition of progress versus urgency, that progress is happening and it's clear, but that urgency is sort of the word of the day because of the way how fast the market is moving and how fast competitors are moving and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think there's a certain sense of urgency in certain areas. I think SAP has a lot of organizational kind of characteristics that make it very difficult to have these changes happen quickly. And so, yeah, I'm kind of stumped as to how to get more of a sense of urgency or get faster change to happen. But it's clear to me that it needs to. If SAP is going to be kind of a credible platform provider, at least credible in the open source or developer ecosystems.
Well, let me ask you something then. I'll answer both of you this, but I'll start with you, Ethan, because you spent a lot of time with this. What would it take for you, now that SAP's kind of shifted to GitHub as one major open source repository, what would it take for you to actively contribute code and applications to an open source? What's missing that needs to happen there?
Well, number one is a project that I'm interested in, but the other prerequisite, and OpenUI5 could be one, but the other prerequisite is to establish kind of bona fides as far as being able to manage one of these communities, which means responding to issues in the open and having an issue process in the open, and accepting community contributions of code. And I don't think that SAP is set up to do that on any of the projects that they're hosting on GitHub at the moment. Many of them do have code hosted out there on GitHub, but they're still it's a one-way street. Like it's software coming out from SAP to the community, but there's nothing that goes back the other direction.
Didn't one of you say before this taping that you're still not comfortable with putting ABAP out in open source for just legal reasons, that you're not completely comfortable yet with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the SAP has been pretty clear in the newest license, if you read it, that the intellectual property when you develop on an ABAP system, a developer ABAP system under the developer license, is owned by the developer. However, SAP Legal and many parties in SAP spent the last 10 or 15 years muddying the waters on that and making it really unclear who owns the IP for any ABAP, even if you write your ABAP in Notepad. And so, in my opinion, consult a lawyer before you do any ABAP add-on development. But
that's inspiring, Ethan. That's really inspiring stuff,
I mean,
man.
Well, with any license, I think that's a good. With any license, if you're starting a business or developing a product, I think that's a good idea to have a lawyer take a look at the license and make sure that you're okay to develop the product. But what would be really helpful, I think, is for SAP and specifically SAP's legal department to try to undo some of the damage that they've done by coming out with a very clear, plain English statement about who owns what you're allowed to do on an ABAP system developing ABAP add-ons. I don't think that's too much to ask, given the last however many years.
Graham, didn't you say that in one of our email exchanges that SAP should have a GitHub ABAP client?
Yeah, absolutely. ABAP GitHub client would be fantastic, and as an independent developer, I want my own ABAP namespace. If I'm going to develop something, I want it in my own namespace.
Yep.
So, do you think those are realistic requests, or are you shooting for the moon here, or is that?
No, I don't think that's shooting for the moon, but I think it's a very simple early on question where you want to engage with the open source community, and it's a question. It's one of those typical questions that would live in SAP for years and years and years with no response in the past. So I think both those questions are great litmus tests of how responsive SAP will be to what the open source community and developers in general want.
Would you consider contributing to an open source project? I know you typically have built more like commercial apps, but would you consider it for SAP? Under what circumstances would you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm more likely to contribute to an open source project that I have an interest in, rather than initiate a project or do something like that. I don't think I'm likely to build an app and make it open source and then do that. But I certainly, if there's a project and you know, the Open UI5 is a perfect example. That's something where I would certainly be interested in contributing to something like that, because that hits me where I live. You know, I'm doing that stuff day in, day out at the moment.
So what would you need from SAP in order to contribute actively to Open UI5?
Well, I mean, first of all, we need to be able to fork it and make our own contributions and have a way of, you know, feeding back changes and things like that. I think I understand SAP have had to hold back some of the SAP UI5 stuff out of the Open UI5 stuff. I understand that. My small tinkering with the Open UI5 stuff, it doesn't appear to me to be a subset of SAP UI5. It looks like a completely different branch. So, for example, I replaced a link to my SAP UI5 library with a link to an Open UI5 library, and my application didn't work. You know, things had changed names and been moved around. I mean, I think that open source component needs to be the core, and SAP need to build their extensions around it, so it's a true collaboration type project.
You know, this word forking that you mentioned, it has almost like a adult connotation.
It does.
What would that mean, like, for an SAP executive who wanted to drive developer engagement but didn't really understand open source that well? Why does forking matter? What is it? Why should SAP provide it?
Well, I mean, SAP in some ways already provided in their transport management to allow for a multiple developers to work on the same code line. You know, you need to be able to take a copy of the current code line at some stage, take it out on your own, develop it, extend it, do whatever you're doing, fix problems, even if it's that, and then reintroduce it into the main branch without breaking everything, getting it back in there. So it's just it's a pretty standard, very standard way of developers are collaborating on the same project together.
Ethan, do you fork?
I have been known to fork, yes. It's kind of funny, 10 years ago, forking had a very negative connotation in open source projects, because to fork an open source project was to try to create a whole new community and take the whole project and say, I don't like how the project's being run, I'm going to fork it and run it myself. And GitHub changed all that, or rather distributed version control systems changed all that, but specifically GitHub really did. And it made forking the kind of the method of adding an improvement to a project that you want to help. So part of the reason it changed was because they actually made it Git itself actually made it very easy to merge projects back together after they'd been forked. So it really changes the whole way that we try to think about developing software. But now it has a very positive connotation, and to fork a project means to improve it usually, and usually contribute those improvements back into the original project. And so that's what we want to be able to do with UI5, and that's why we're frustrated that it's not happening.
Do you think it could happen?
I don't see why not. If they're able to release it under an Apache license, there are lots of companies that run open source projects and accept community contributions. I don't see anything standing in the way of it. SAP's legal department may not agree with that, but lots of other legal departments at other very big companies seem to think that it's okay. So I'm a little stumped. Yeah, but I mean, honestly, yeah, I do fork things. I do contribute back to projects on GitHub. I have contributed back to other projects on GitHub. If I could figure out how to install the Zake Git client on ABAP for NetWeaver, I would contribute back to ABAP open source projects. I use some of them. I use the Mach-A framework that's made by a guy named Uwe Kunath. It's a great framework. It really, really helps make unit testing in the ABAP environment a lot easier. I use it. I report issues back to him. He's fixed them. I would fix them myself if I could figure out how to get this stupid Git client to work. but I can't, so life is tough.
Yeah, let's talk about commercial applications a little bit. Graham, you've built successful commercial applications for your business, but you also are somewhat critical about the pathway with some of the modern UI and SAP application tools. So how do we make sense of your successes versus what you're looking for?
Well, I mean, the things that I've built are primarily because I'm fortunate that I know the SAP backend technology well enough to be able to build, if you like, both sides of it. And so let's say if I'm building something that's got using some UI technology that's not from SAP, I can use the tools that come with the SAP backend system to expose what I need, expose the APIs, and call them from other applications or make them available for other people. That requires a pretty broad skills base to go from grassroots ABAP stuff through the, one of the things that a lot of people, when you talk about ABAP programs, a lot of people don't consider that ABAP programming is not just about syntax and program structure and design and that. A lot of it's about knowing which field in which table in the ERP system holds this information, because there aren't enough vendor-provided APIs to get that information. So a lot of traditional ABAP development skill sets is knowing the data model, which is not what the modern programmers are used to. The modern programmers are used to, we want an API, show us the API and the endpoint. The API should be self-describing pretty much, so we don't need much more help, a little bit of documentation. And away we can go. We can use whatever our tool set is, whatever we want to interact with that back-end engine to call that API and work with it exclusively. That's not the SAP world at the moment.
Mm. Yeah, you said something about the importance of content and data leading up to our video. Does this fit into that?
Absolutely. So I see what a developer wants is two broad things: content and data. And the content is the standard stuff. You know, documentation, code samples, tutorials, all those sort of things. Access to tool sets and the tools and things like that to do all that sort of stuff. That's the content. The data is essentially the exposed logic so that we can call it through open APIs. And that's what SAP have been very remiss in producing forever now. You know, we've been through the web methods business connector and the SOA and the eSOA and the SOAP handlers, and now we're at Gateway. All these are technologies to allow a developer to expose SAP functionality, but SAP haven't done that themselves. There is no open standard API for calling SAP functionality. You need to know these things, and in fact, you need to build them yourselves. You know, SAP, you know, those great BAPIs that everyone talks about. You know, we call a BAPI for the back-end SAP back-end functionality. The BAPIs are remote RFC-enabled function modules. They're designed for machine-to-machine stuff. They primarily pass around primary keys. So if you call a BAPI to get details of a sales order, it'll give you the customer number, the primary key of the customer. So you've got to go looking for the customer details to find out who it was, which is pretty important stuff in a sales order, to have a customer details, things like that. So you have to enhance those things to provide what your UI. So suddenly you've got this coupling between what you're building at the back end with the UI that you've had to put on front of it. It's just madness. Whereas all that plumbing, all that business execution, because that's ultimately what SAP provide as a business execution engine, that should just be exposed as open, usable APIs, and that's where I think they really missed the boat. That's why they're going to struggle to get developers in there, because a developer comes in, let's say I come in and I'm a great Xcode developer building apps for iPhones left, right, and center. I don't know how to create a sales order. There is no API available to say, hey, create sales order. There's no such thing, you know. You got to figure out who the customers are, and you know what all the fields are you need to fill into these bizarre ERP data structures to be able to call the back end in the right way and then handle the exceptions and the results. It's a nightmare. You need coverage right from the bottom of the back end to the top of the front end.
Yeah, you have to know a ton to do even a little. I mean, the APIs that exist are very thin layers over the underlying functionality in SAP, and it's really difficult to engage with. It's not accessible.
There's been a lot of talk about the API economy. This is one of the cool phrases. Like, so if you're a blogger like me, if you can like work that into a post, it makes you look really cool. And
you know, I'm not like buzzwords, John.
Right. And in all fairness, it is kind of neat when you start looking at some of the stories, especially things like public sector, you know, like even cities that have opened up APIs, and developers have come to the aid of local nonprofits and governance and built cool stuff. So it does seem to me to have some power behind the hype. From SAP's vantage point, how would you go about addressing that at this point? Is there a way to go forward with this topic if SAP agrees that it's important?
Well, my thinking about this is that SAP are moving to some sort of rebuilding or refactoring their execution engines on the HANA platform. The Business One stuff and things like that they're looking at first and moving through. So they're effectively looking at building a new ERP system on that platform, and that platform provides almost baked into the platform is this API facility. So you know, the HANA platform doesn't have any UI technology into it, so they have to build it with APIs in it so that the UI technology, whether it's UI5 or something else sitting on top of it, can consume it. Now, their problem, of course, is the legacy Business Suite applications that don't have that. But if they put enough governance around what those APIs are going to look like, there is no reason that they couldn't have an identical interface sitting over the top of their ERP back end, so that developers developing for whatever the underlying platform are could develop the same application. It could easily consume an on-premise business suite as well as a B1 as well as a whatever else it might be on the HANA Cloud platform or the innovation platform or whatever it's going to be called as well. So I think that's probably one way of moving forward. Whether they've got the willingness and the bandwidth to put that level of effort into, I always pull up the GL. There is R2 ABAP code still in the GL of Business Suite. So to build APIs on top of that and expose that is not a trivial thing.
Graham, I think we had a slight glitch in your sound right when you were saying about the GL. Were you trying to say the amount of ABAP code in the GL?
What I was just saying about the GL is there's still legacy R2 code that's just been
code
straight into the GL. So for someone to come into SAP and say, hey, listen, I want an open, whatever it is, an OData service that I can post into the GL in there, SAP people are going to roll their eyes and think, geez, we don't want to expose that sort of stuff to the outside world to start throwing stuff in there. But that plumbing to make that work should all be handled by that business execution engine and should all be hidden from the person calling the API. Deathly silence. You're all wondering what I said, aren't you?
I can agree with that, definitely.
I was waiting for Ethan's wit to
agree. Yeah, no wit. It's just agreement at this point. Yeah, I think that's a key is to open up these APIs. I mean, SAP's tried this, as Graham, as you said, multiple times. I mean, there was all this SOAP stuff in the enterprise services workplace, and it was the right direction, but none of these things have ever lasted really, and so or been particularly accessible to outside developers, and so I guess never really took off. So when we develop add-ons, we're still working with these VAPI function modules, which are absolutely a nightmare. The data structures you have to engage with and the amount of internal application logic you have to be aware of in order to use even a relatively simple like master data update API is insane. And so wrapping those and abstracting those and making those much more available to developers that maybe aren't quite as familiar with all of the nuances of SAP would be a great thing.
And you don't think that Gateway fully accomplishes that then?
Well, Gateway doesn't offer APIs. It offers the ability to build APIs. Right. And it's up to the person who builds them to deal with the abstraction and wrapping of the business logic. So it's a good framework, but I think what Graham's getting at and what I would like to see is for SAP, whenever they go back and touch an old business process area or develop a new application, to have a standard type of API that needs to be provided for all of the business processes that are within that application. They did something very similar for getting data out of ERP and their business suite applications and into making it available to BW and to data services and other BI tools, and then eventually HANA, and it really helped them. They eventually settled on a standard, what they called extractor concept, which sucked the data out of the application and into an external tool. And they required that any new business suite application or any old business suite application that was retouched had to implement these extractors in a particular format. So it's possible they can do it, but an API that goes both directions and allows updates as well is more difficult. It would be a good thing to see.
So just to be clear, we don't have a whole lot of time, but I want to make sure we get this right. You think it does make sense to go back into the ERP 6.0 and to add APIs where relevant as opposed to simply focusing on refactoring applications for the HANA platform where a lot of this stuff is baked in? You think there is an argument for going back a little bit as well?
Well, when they're refactored, you should fix them. So when they're refactored, you should make them accessible to developers. I'm not sure about the business case for going back, but
gotcha. So not just for the new platform you're saying, but for existing customers as well.
it's a pain point. I mean,
Yeah.
it's something that could be a lot better for developers because I tell you, like when I show some of the stuff that I work on to non-SAP developers, and I'm like, yeah, this is how the API works, and like you have to be aware of this and that, and this is what the data structure looks like. Their jaws drop. It's not a normal thing. So it would be good to get a little bit more industry standard there.
Okay, so I probably want to run for like 10 more minutes. So there's two topics I want to hit, so maybe five each, but let's turn our attention to that non-SAP developer a little more fully now. This might be a so-called millennial. It might be someone who just has a lot of brilliant coding ideas, but maybe became disillusioned with throwing up iOS apps that aren't getting bought in the overcrowded store, and maybe they have interest in enterprise development. Maybe they ran into SAP at like a TechCrunch hacker event or what have you, where SAP tends to have a presence these days. What is the key, you think, to engaging these folks where you don't have the anecdote, Ethan, that you described of like, oh my God, like that's one heck of a like car hood you're showing me underneath there, versus like, man, I want to get in this car and like drive this thing. Like, what has to change?
I think we have to come to them. I mean, there is a way of doing things outside of SAP, and then there's a way of doing things inside of SAP, and those are two very different ways of doing things. So to appeal to non-SAP developers, I think we have to, at least to some extent, kind of hold out an olive branch, which may be in the form of some documentation, but also in the form of software and interfaces that they can relate to. So I think that's the key thing. I mean, I told you guys the story of the one pull request on the OpenUI5 GitHub repository, where like normally the way that you give feedback on open source projects on GitHub is you open an issue, but SAP disabled the issue functionality. So this guy like forked the whole project, changed the README to include issues that he thought were important, and then made a pull request to like try to get it merged back into the project, and that's how he engaged. But I mean, how many tens of other developers tried, like looked at it and had some feedback, and there was no way to give feedback, and so they just gave up and walked away.
Graham, you got something for the millennials, right? Come on.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess it's the same thing I've just been talking about. If someone comes along with some development skills in a particular application development platform, and they want to, they're interested in the SAP customer base because it's a huge ecosystem, a huge customer base. It's a great potential market for what they're building. They want to be able to build something now that does whatever they want, whatever their great idea is, by hitting that customer's back-end execution engine, which for everyone at the moment is ECC6. And so he needs to engage with a traditional SAP developer to build and expose the APIs to his specification to make it work, which is just a nightmare. Or if there was open, usable, published APIs for the standard business suite stuff, he could just build it and sell it. Away you go and sell it to every SAP customer. And that's what he can't do. You can't just walk in with knowing a bit of Xcode or .NET or whatever it is, or even if it's PHP or whatever it is you think you're going to build. You can't just wander in and give me some logon credentials to your back-end ERP system and I'm going to build an app. You just can't do that. You can't do that on your own in isolation.
Yeah.
And one of the things we didn't touch on before when we talked about how important APIs are, the Twitter story is an amazing story about how successful they were because they opened up their API, and you remember the feedback when they started shutting it down because, but I would argue that Twitter wouldn't have gone anywhere without that openness of that API. And the reason it was so successful was because the UIs to deal with it were so fantastically better than the one Twitter had.
Still are.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, the other piece of that, aside from the API interface that makes it easy to walk up and create an app and sell it to SAP customers, is the store concept and the ability to actually place something into a store that is accessible to SAP customers without having to go through a huge rigmarole of legal and partnership kind of nonsense. And so there is a program in place, the SAP Partner Edge for app development, I think it's called. And just the name itself might give you the impression that it is a little bit heavier than it needs to be. But it's a lot better than SAP's traditional partner program theoretically, but I think SAP needs to do some real work to make it clear that it's been tried out, that it works, that there's a clear path from I have an idea of an app I want to make, and I'm not an SAP partner, all the way through I'm actually getting checks from SAP because I'm selling an app on the App Store. And like there should be no lack of transparency at any point in that process. I should be able to look at it from day one and say, I know exactly how much it's going to cost and exactly how much time it's going to take to go through this whole process. Otherwise, there's no way I can make a business decision about whether I want to move forward with my idea.
Yeah, and I would add to that SAP's been on a arduous, I guess you could say, multi-year journey to consolidate its online storefronts and then sort of create what you might call a delightful shopping experience for apps. And I think that is a journey SAP is still far from the final destination, but there is definitely efforts there. There's a new HANA apps marketplace that's the next crack at that I think might be a model going forward. So it does seem to me this goes back to that Fiori discussion a little bit, which is you want customers to be able to buy apps like without just getting the call from the account executive, right? You want them to be able to consume some applications via a storefront because that's kind of where a lot of this is going, at least for smaller point applications and things like that. Am I correct in thinking like that?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, yeah. From my point of view, the ideal thing would be is if you decide which store you want to put it on. Why shouldn't you build an app and publish it on the Apple Store, and have people find it there and pick it up and away they go? You know, you should be able to do all of those things. And so, if nothing else, the stores could compete with each other. Now, clearly, the SAP store should be able to offer you enhanced marketing and promotional of your app in amongst the SAP customer base, but there shouldn't be anything unique about their store that stops you using another store if you choose to either.
So what would you guys, this was, Ethan, you were very insightful because that was the last topic I wanted to hit was the storefronts. What do you think SAP needs to do next on the sort of store area? 'Cause they have put some resources into it, so what's next? Come on, you got something.
I would say I think that, I mean, just making the process easier and more transparent is the first step. I think the second step is to provide really clear value to developers and to SAP customers beyond what other storefronts can provide. So providing enterprise applications, be they mobile applications or some kind of add-on to an SAP system, is a lot more complicated than the process for providing mobile applications through the Apple App Store. There are a lot more moving parts and a lot more systems integration work that has to happen. And SAP Store could provide real value there. But you know, the first step is to be as good as the other guys, right? So like first, let's just let people get apps out there and sell them and make that process easier. And then, but let's also take the next step and provide a lot more value in an area that SAP knows a lot about through both their acquisitions and their internal experience. This B2B and enterprise software model, yeah, there are some real unique requirements there. So meet them, provide value there. But first of all, you gotta just do the simple stuff.
Silence as I
we
wait
might have a
for
leg with Graham.
silence as I wait for the Australian viewpoint.
Absolutely, you know, you got to do the simple stuff. There's no doubt about it. You know, and I mean, the SAP store, as you rightly say, it's just there's been so many of them, and they've all wandered off in their own little rabbit holes, and then they all wander back together again, and we wait and see if they wander off again. You know, from my point of view, I've only ever seen it as brochureware. It's just a way of getting the name up there and then click a button for go here for more information. It's not really. I haven't seen anything that convinces me that it's what I think a store is.
Right.
I also think there's a big. Oh, sorry, Ethan. What were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to say it's sort of like EcoHub. I mean, it's kind of it's sort of like a billboard, and it needs to be a lot more than that. And for some things, it is at the moment. So with the cloud, with the cloud applications that you can launch through the store, like that's great. But they need to get it down with to the point where you can click a button to buy a piece of software and get it installed, and like. That's all there is to it. You click a button, you get the software, the developer gets money. That's what a store does, right?
Yeah. Also, I will throw out a little bit of blasphemy for those of you who are stuck the discussion out, which is I think that stores and community need to eventually merge, and I'm sure SCN diehards would hate the sound of that, but anyway, I just want to throw that out there. So we should wrap up. So let's just do a quick hit around the circle. I'll start first, and then you guys can go. Just kind of takeaways, next steps, where you see this heading. For me, the thing that really stuck out from the Fall Tech Ed season is I was really encouraged about SAP positioning HANA as a platform, because to me, platform is about supporting application development, and I feel like that platform vision, if they hold true to that, will spur a lot of this. But I will say, based on our discussion today, I also have that feeling that there's so much to do, and the pace of change in the market is just accelerating. And I don't know that's not SAP's fault, but I think that is SAP's predicament. And hopefully, the response to this kind of content is to light the fire to say, yeah, a lot of the vision is right, but you got to move a lot faster, because that's what's happening.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think just while you were sort of saying some of that stuff, I just thought that maybe one of the things that SAP could do is I still don't think SAP really get what these external non-SAP developers are after and want to do. So they claim the App House ID was pretty successful around the design thinking and the UI type stuff. Maybe an App House satellite that they spin off and get some external developers and get them writing and building apps and publishing them and getting them going, so they have to go through that pain might not be a bad way to go for them to learn what some of these challenges are.
Sort of like a reality show. You take non-SAP developers and you throw them into an SAP system and then watch the chaos.
Take a traditional SAP developer and throw them at Git and get them trying to figure out how that works, how GitHub works.
And that would be a lot of fun. John Graham, I completely agree with you. I think that last year has been encouraging. There were some good improvements at the end of the year last year around developer engagement, around openness, around kind of modernizing the ecosystem a little bit with the HANA platform. What do I want to see next? I want to see real openness, and I want to see SAP taking a real responsibility for stewarding a true open source project, like hopefully OpenUI 5 becomes. I'd like to see more software available for developers and for people who just want to try it out. So not just the suite or the platforms, but also like the BI software, especially, is an interest of mine. And they're doing better there, but I want to see downloadable versions of it, because especially for developers, you want to have your development environment be local, and developing on a database that lives out in the cloud is not really a great idea if you want to have any kind of quick development cycle. So I think we do need actual software we can install on our computers, theoretically, which also gets around the whole Amazon is too expensive argument that some people have. And lastly, I'd like to see some clarification around the IP issues. I know SAP has done a lot of work to try to get the licenses sorted out, and it's nice and uniform now. I'd like to see somebody who's actually responsible for the area come out in the community and explain exactly what the situation is with some authority. So that's what I'd really like to see in the next year.
All right, sounds like a full plate. Maybe we'll revisit. Maybe we'll do it in 12 months instead of 15, because there's so much to talk about, I think.
It
But,
depends. Maybe they'll do it all in the next 3 months, and we'll have to
Yeah,
come back in 4 months and say,
call
well,
it a wrap.
yeah, that's it.
Say it's done. All right. Well, that's the
Code is
challenge.
the answer.
Yeah, right. You guys weren't as grouchy as I thought you would be. Well done.
Sorry, John. I apologize.
But
I hope
we got
agree.
we got a pretty nice Graham rant. It wasn't quite vintage, but we got a pretty good one. I think about 2/3 of the way through. So
I did okay.
maybe just took you a little while to warm up. I think. All right, folks. Thanks for joining us. That's it. That's a wrap.